A concrete slab, 6 feet across, sits flush with the earth on a Bavarian hillside. A rusted chain loops through a heavy padlock. A faded sign warns Zutritt verboten, entry forbidden. The air around the slab is cold and thin. Winter frost rims the edges, and every breath comes out a small cloud. For decades, the slab has been a promise and a threat. A promise that something beneath it would not be seen, and a threat that whatever lay below should remain buried. A state geologist, hair white at the temple, slides a ring of keys from his pocket. He moves with the practiced slowness of someone who knows it is safer to be methodical than quick. He turns one key, then another. Metal rasp. A bolt retracts. The padlock clatters into the dirt. The camera, held by permission, with escorts, after months of negotiation, follows him as he crouches and peels back a second hidden hatch. A ladder descends into a black throat. A smell comes up. Damp stone, old iron, the metallic tang of compressed air and oil long since evaporated. The geologist pauses at the lip of the shaft and looks down, not at the relics, but at the absence the shaft once intended to keep. He speaks not to the camera, but to the hill itself. No one was supposed to find this place underground, he says. That sentence is less a line than a verdict. It frames everything that follows. Behind the slab lies a system of tunnels and chambers that were never meant to be part of history as we know it. They were meant to be part of a secret apparatus, protected from sight and attack, whose very design depended on silence and concealment. What those tunnels sheltered, who labored within them, and what they were intended to produce are the bones of a story about ambition, desperation, and the human price paid when secrecy becomes policy. By 1943, the calculus of the war had changed. Allied air power, honed over years of strategic bombing, made factory roofs the most dangerous piece of national infrastructure. What could be seen from the sky could be destroyed from above. For the Nazi leadership, the answer was simple in theory: move production below ground. The Reich's armaments machine, directed by Albert Speer as Minister of Armaments and War Production, began to plan not for dispersed small-scale workshops, but for entire manufacturing complexes within rock. Speer, in his memoranda and later memoirs, argued that underground industry would save the armaments supply in the face of sustained bombing. He secured budgets, redrew maps, and ordered funds that by conservative estimates ran into the hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. In practice, those sums were poured into shafts, galleries, timbering, concrete linings, and the logistics of moving men, machines, and materials into places designed to be out of sight. The decision had technical causes and moral consequences.
Technically, specialists argued about ventilation, power, and access, how to get molten metal into a cavern without boiling the air, how to keep machining centers functioning where water seeped constantly from the rock. Morally, the plan depended on an existing system that saw people not as workers with rights, but as a pool of expendable labor. The SS and the civilian armaments bureaucracy coordinated to supply that labor. Prisoners from concentration camps, transported in sealed cars, arriving weak, filthy, and often undernourished, were assigned to tunnels by the thousands. The regime's language obscured the reality: special construction detachments, labor deployment. The outcome was plain in practice. Men and women were forced to dig, to carry, to set forms for concrete, to blast, to haul out rubble. Many died of exhaustion, exposure, disease, and the injuries of hurried, dangerous work. Those who planned the relocation included technical minds whose names have echoed through post-war accounts: Werner von Braun, associated with the rocket work at Peenemünde, and other engineers who mapped the movement of specialized production underground. Joseph Goebbels, the Ministry of Propaganda, framed some of these efforts as last glorious acts of national ingenuity, while behind the words, the SS administered the labor that made the words possible. It is critical to say this plainly. The same bureaucratic network that enabled technical projects also enabled murder through neglect and brutality. Any admiration for technical problem-solving must be immediately checked by remembering on what shoulders those solutions were built. The choice to go underground produced different kinds of sites across the Reich. Some were turned-out mines and quarry caverns, vast open halls already carved from stone. Others were newly dug tunnel systems, lined in concrete and wired for electricity. The objectives varied: aircraft components and whole airframes, rocket stages, engine blocks, and even research into chemical weapons. But the pattern was the same everywhere: concealment, coerced labor, extreme conditions. Consider the work at Neckarsulm and the nearby town of Neustadt in southwestern Germany. There, a network of former salt and gypsum mines offered enormous irregular caverns with columns of stone between them. Converting mines into production halls seemed efficient on paper: large spaces, existing access galleries, and the stability of deep stone. Engineers drove scaffolds and laid tracks. Massive cranes were installed in tunnels where natural light never penetrated. In some caverns they built assembly lines, crude, rock-ceilinged corridors in which wings were attached and fuselages rolled. These subterranean factories were intended for volume. The metal shavings, the smell of machine oil, and the continuous chug of lathes were meant to be heard only by those who worked there. The human reality, as survivors later reported, was harsher. Prisoners housed in converted barracks above ground were marched down into the mines under guard. Ventilation was seldom adequate. Dust from constant blasting coated lungs as easily as the stone itself, and miners' lamps could do little to keep the grinding breath of iron from settling into throat and chest. Max Mannheimer, one of the survivors whose testimony is preserved in post-war records, remembered arrival in a place where light was rationed and names were not. He described the work as calculated to destroy you slowly. Those words, short and direct, anchor the archival record. Individuals became units of labor measured for their output, not their survival. Further north, in the town of Kehla, the focus shifted to jet propulsion. As the Luftwaffe sought speed and altitude advantages that conventional piston engines could no longer deliver, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational jet fighter, loomed as a technological promise. Messerschmitt's design offices and engine manufacturers like BMW were pressured to shield production from air raids. Factories were concealed inside tunnels hewn into hillsides and inside reinforced halls carved from rock. To create the spaces needed for precision engineering, workers blasted caverns and set up clean areas, or attempted to, in conditions that were anything but clean. Those who labored on aircraft components in Kehla and similar sites faced unique difficulties. Jet engines and airframes require tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. They require clean machining environments and steady, reliable power. Achieving that underground was an engineering headache. Dust had to be kept away from compressor blades, heat had to be drawn off from testing benches, and test runs had to be muffled to avoid detection by enemy reconnaissance. In practice, improvisation filled the gaps. Makeshift enclosures, rudimentary filters, and borrowed generators produced enough capability to assemble parts, but not without cost. The machines vibrated against the living rock, and explosions from rock reinforcements sometimes threw clouds of grit into the production halls. Workers, already hungry and thin, breathed particles that would erode their lungs long after the war ended. The Me 262 arrived too late to change the strategic balance of the air war. Production in underground sites could not reach the scale required, and logistical bottlenecks, parts shortages, transport delays, insufficient testing meant many aircraft were delivered incomplete or never flew as intended. The narrative is technical and practical, but it is also moral. The creation of a jet fighter in secret, under the eyes of men who could not refuse to work, reframes innovation within a system of compulsion. The deeper story is not merely about machinery. It is about what happens when state power treats human beings as inputs in a secret calculation.
In the winter of 1944, transports arrived from Auschwitz and other camps, according to surviving camp rolls and transport lists. Men in striped uniforms were issued the same boots as the miners, then marched down into the galleries. Records from camp administrators show transfers to construction details. SS paperwork logged hours, rations, and the depletion of the labor pool. Where the paperwork and the human stories intersect, the truth becomes unbearable in its ordinariness. Illness ran through the barracks, and the nearest hospital, if one existed, was often little more than a place to die more slowly. Men collapsed at their benches and were buried in makeshift graves, or not at all. Still, making the underground plan a reality required labor of many kinds: geologists who could find suitable rock formations, civil engineers who could redesign mine galleries as production halls, electricians who could wire up plants with generators and switchgear, logistics officers who scheduled the trains. Heinz Rabi, the state geologist we meet at the opening, is a living thread between the wartime and post-war landscapes. He was a young engineer when the projects began, assigned to survey sites and report on their structural soundness. He has seen the change from calculation to catastrophe. In recent interviews, Rabi described the sensation of walking into a newly dug cavern and feeling the echo of a place that had been built to conceal tragedy. You enter a room, he remembered, and your steps have to be careful because decades have hollowed out the supports. His voice, even now, carries the small, haunted cadence of someone who has been asked to keep watch over wrongs he could not stop. The effort to move weapons production underground did not follow a single uniform plan. It was a mosaic, sites selected based on geology, proximity to existing rail and road networks, political priorities, and the availability of forced labor. The economy of secrecy favored places that were remote enough to discourage inspection, but accessible enough to allow raw materials and finished products to move when needed. In some regions, former industrial towns became subterranean hubs. In others, the newly dug galleries remained incomplete at the moment of collapse in 1945. The resources poured into these projects were immense by the standards of a wartime economy under siege. Speer's ministry rerouted funds and materials to prioritize underground conversion. Concrete was used not only to line tunnels, but to camouflage entrances and to erect false facades that would mislead reconnaissance. Timbering was shipped in to support galleries, and tracks were laid for narrow-gauge rail that carried slags, castings, and men.
These investments were not without return. Some production did shift below ground and did manage to continue for months despite bombing. But the accounting must include the human cost and the inefficiency that comes from building the very factories that were meant to avoid being bombed. Hidden facilities were, in many cases, slower and more expensive than the surface plants they replaced. Intelligence and countermeasures played a central role in the dynamic. Allied reconnaissance aircraft, flying high and taking photographs in the precise wavelengths that revealed vents, service roads, and disturbed Earth, began to map signs of subterranean works. Analysts learned to read shadows and smoke plumes. They identified air vents, water discharges, and rail spur patterns. Once a suspected site was identified, the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces evaluated options. Some targets were bombed directly. Others were marked for special munitions designed to rupture reinforced concrete or collapse galleries. The intent was twofold: to destroy the structure and to destroy the laboring capacity within. Yet even Allied operations faced limits. Bombing could collapse a roof and render a production line useless, but it could also trap forced laborers beneath rubble, leaving them to die where they had been working. There were tactical debates among Allied planners, whether to strike at the facility and accept the immediate human toll, or to attempt to disrupt supply lines and spare lives at the cost of leaving the infrastructure intact. These were moral decisions that accompanied military ones, and they did not always have clear or satisfying answers. As the tunnels took shape, secrecy became its own labor. Entrances were hidden beneath barns, under roads, inside quarries. False facades, drainage outlets, and peculiar stack emissions were designed to mislead aerial analysts. Yet secrecy is porous. Vents showed on photos. Smoke betrayed test firing. Local populations noticed increased guard presence, movement of materials at odd hours, and the sudden disappearance of men from their communities. Rumor spread. The state attempted to nail the mouths of rumor with restrictions, arrests, and propaganda. But some knowledge seeped out, and after the war, much more did. The project did not proceed uniformly. In some places, engineers managed to create controlled environments for delicate assembly. In others, the work was rudimentary and improvisational. The government's push underground intersected with local realities in unpredictable ways. Where geological conditions were poor, work stalled. Where transportation links were interrupted, assemblies piled up unfinished. The ambitions of centralized planners were thus constantly negotiated on the ground by foremen, geologists, and the inexorable limits of human endurance. When we speak of what was intended to be built under the hills, jets, rocket motors, and even chemicals, we must keep the context firmly in view.
Technical achievement in isolation is not a triumph when it rests on coercion and murder. The V-2 rocket, for example, was a technological leap that required precise machining and complex assembly. Wernher von Braun and his team at Peenemünde had earlier pushed rocketry into a new age, but the move underground did not absolve them of the moral landscape. Rockets must be understood as instruments produced by a system that conscripted human lives. That system used names, forms, and processes to mask its crimes. The rockets, like the industrial halls, were objects that demanded an accounting that includes both metal and blood. After the geologist and his small team descend, the camera follows, hand-held and careful, down narrow stairways and along damp corridors. Water beads on the ceiling and falls to the floor in small, persistent drops, a rhythmic, metallic percussion that underscores how long these spaces have been left to breathe. The walls are scored with drill marks and shotcrete patches. In some places, rusted rails still run along the floors, and in others, broken machinery sticks out like fossilized bones. The camera lingers on a corroded nameplate half buried in silt, a manufacturer's logo whose letters are softened by time. It is evidence of continuity. These places were factories, and they were filled with the signs of regular work. Yet the human story is not visible at first glance. It requires testimony. The testimony is short but piercing. An elderly man, his voice cracked, speaks into an audio tape recorded years earlier. "We were not counted. They moved men like timber." Max Mannheimer's recollection is a small, clear shard in the larger mosaic. It anchors the statistics in flesh. When he recalls the way guards beat a drum against the barrack door to call men down into the galleries, the ordinary cruelty of the daily routine becomes a moral line on which the broader story turns. These testimonies are brief by necessity. They are the moments the record allows us to inhabit the human scale amid geologic and bureaucratic forces. As the film moves outward from the opening in Bavaria to a map of Europe, man-made dots appear, a cluster here, a line there. Each is a story. Neckarselm, Neustadt, Kalla, Mittelbau Dora near Nordhausen, the coastal shafts at Votten and the Mimioeki site, Falkenhagen, where plans for chemical production lurked in the paperwork. Each name carries a different technical emphasis and a different human toll. Some are large, some are small, some are barely begun.
Together, they paint the outline of a national effort to make war beyond the reach of bombs. Our focus in the coming sections will shift site by site, not to indulge the machines, but to understand the systems that produced them. Here, in the first movement of this investigation, the questions are simple and urgent. Why did powerful leaders decide that secrecy underground was the only viable path? Who paid the price for that secrecy?
And what traces did they leave behind in concrete, rust, and testimony that we can examine now? If this exploration matters to you and you want to see archival evidence, survivor testimony, and on-the-ground documentation from these sites, subscribe to follow the investigation. There is more to see, and permission to enter these places is rare and tightly controlled. What you will see here is gathered with legal access and archival cooperation. The work at Neckarsulm deserves more attention. There, engineers pried open the sides of a hill and extended galleries into the rock face, creating an interior geography that mirrored the aspirations of the armaments ministry. Floors were poured, cranes and rails installed. In the deeper caverns, whole production flows were envisioned. Raw blocks of alloy would be forged and then carried on trolleys to machining bays. Wings would be fitted in assembly halls large enough to test fitments, while heavy doors sealed against the outside. But conversion did not erase the past use of the site. The old mine shafts had been worked for centuries, and their irregularity complicated attempts to create the clean lines a factory needs. The workers assigned to Neckarsulm were a miscellany of coerced labor and local conscripts. Some skilled metalworkers were attached to forced labor contingents, others were local men pressed into overtime under threat. Prisoners arrived from farther afield under SS escort. The official papers attempted to sort people into categories: skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled, but in the end, the designation mattered little when rations, shelter, and medical care were all allocated according to output. The physical conditions of underground work are deceptively simple to describe, but devastating in practice. Limited daylight meant circadian rhythms were ruined. Heat from machinery raised temperatures in winter and chilled workers in summer when damp stone stole warmth. The ventilation systems, often improvised, moved air but also carried particulate matter from blasting and cutting. Respiratory diseases that would take decades to claim their full toll were initiated in those galleries. Broken teeth, chronic coughs, and permanent joint damage were common. The factory could produce a piece of metal for the war while creating a lifetime of injury for the man who shaped it. Attempts at maintaining quality in such environments required extraordinary oversight. Engineers, tortured with problems of tolerances, insisted on precise jigs and checks. Parts that left Neckarsulm were often inspected at downstream plants and adjusted or rejected. The delays that emerged from this ad hoc subterranean production undermined the very purpose of secrecy. One must ask whether the theory of protecting production beneath the earth ever truly accounted for the practical losses incurred by moving into a space hostile to precision manufacture.
Kayla's story again shows the interplay between technological urgency and moral cost. Jet engine components require balancing and testing that is difficult even in purpose-built hangars. In a cavern, the margin for error shrinks. Engines were mounted to test stands and run in partial silence to avoid revealing their signature to reconnaissance. Test runs produced heat and noise that strained the ingenuity of engineers who built mufflers and diverted exhaust to trick detectors.
None of these technical solutions addressed the daily reality that the men who welded, machined, and handled the hot metal were doing so with little rest and insufficient food. Their bodies paid for technical progress in ways that the machinery never could account for. The pattern of recruitment and coercion varied by site, but the underlying mechanism was the same. The SS and related agencies supplied human labor, while the armaments bureaucracy supplied machines, plans, and supervision. The result was a multi-headed network in which no single arm bore full responsibility for the outcomes. This diffusion of responsibility was, in a grim way, part of the design. It allowed planners to argue technical necessity, engineers to insist on feasibility, and the security apparatus to supply men without accountability. After the war, that diffusion would complicate efforts to pin blame, but it does nothing to relieve the moral clarity of what happened. By the time the winter of 1944-45 arrived, some sites were functioning at partial capacity, others were still under construction, and a number were in chaotic flux as front lines shifted and materials dwindled. Speer's plans could not overcome the realities of a collapsing regime. Transport networks broke, raw materials were stolen or destroyed en route, and the SS diverted resources to other immediate needs. The subterranean program never reached a scale sufficient to make the degree of difference its architects hoped for. Yet this practical failure did not mean the suffering was any less real. What follows in the next portion of this investigation will move toward the heart of that suffering, the large tunnel complexes where V2 production and mass forced labor intersected. There, at sites like Mittelbau-Dora, the industrial imperative and the machinery of death came into the closest contact. Before we descend into that darker space, it is important to hold this question in mind. Buildings and machines can be repaired or dismantled, but testimony and memory live elsewhere. In the names recorded by survivors, in the photographs taken in haste at liberation, in the railway lists that catalogued transports. Those fragments are the moral architecture we are obliged to reconstruct. We close this section not at an ending, but at a seam. The slab on the Bavarian slope is closed for now, its hatch latched, the geologist's keys returned to a pocket.
Yet the hatch's existence tells us that secrecy is a strategy that outlives those who first invoked it. It persists as legal restriction, as hazard, and as memory deferred. Below the hill, the tunnels continue to hold what they were made to hide: tools, rails, and the echo of footsteps. Above, the landscape goes on without obvious change: fields, roads, a village church spire catching the afternoon sun. The contrast is vivid and intolerable. In the next part of this investigation, we will move to the larger subterranean factories and, where the record allows, listen to the voices of those who survived them. The latter ends in a narrow landing where the air changes from the sharp clarity of the surface to a heavy, recycled breath. The light from the geologist's lamp folds into the long shadow of the corridor, and the walls close in with a smell of stone, grease, and something older. The faint, persistent tang of decay that time leaves in places built to be shut away. Here the passage widens into a cavern whose scale only becomes visible when the light sweeps across its curving roof. Rows of booths, tracks sunk into the floor, the ghost of an overhead rail. This is the Mittelwerk at the Konstein, the underground factory where the V2 rocket was put together. It is the place where the technical story and the human tragedy are most tightly braided. The V2, called the A4 by its designers, required parts that were both precise and heavy: turbopumps, combustion chambers, guidance gyros, warheads, and casings. At Peenemünde, engineers had pioneered the design.
By 1943 and 1944, under constant threat from the air, the logic of concealment pushed the assembly lines into mountain galleries that could hide both production and the people who made it. Wernher von Braun's association with the rocket program is a matter of record. He led teams that designed and tested components that would become the first long-range ballistic missiles. That technological lineage exists. It must be stated without praise and without understatement. Engineers solved problems that advanced rocketry, but those achievements were embedded in a system that depended on brutal coercion, a system in which the SS supplied the manpower and in which prisoners' lives were treated as expendable inputs. Mittelbau Dora was not an abstract site. It was an organized industrial crucible. Trains brought inmates from Auschwitz and other camps in sealed cars. SS guards oversaw the roll calls and assignments. Inside the galleries, prisoners worked under watchful eyes to meet quotas. They were assigned to tasks, welding, riveting, casing assembly, and their labor was measured. The work was dangerous, handling oxygen and alcohol fuels, managing heavy castings, and running machines in conditions where ventilation and lighting were inadequate. Many were malnourished, many had recently recovered from other transports and were already weakened by prior camps' deprivations.
Disease spread quickly in the close quarters. Records from the time and later camp registers indicate an appalling mortality. Estimates vary. Historians place the number of deaths associated with Mittelbau Dora and its satellite camps in the thousands, with some studies suggesting figures in the tens of thousands across the entire Dora system when secondary mortality from exhaustion and disease is included. These are estimates, recorded unevenly and disputed in detail. The human fact, however, is not in dispute. Large numbers of prisoners perished as a direct consequence of the labor regime. Survivor testimony gives the rawness of that fact a human face. One former inmate recalled years later that the galleries felt like a bell that never stopped ringing, a description that compresses fatigue, repeated alarms, and the constant presence of guards into a single image. Another survivor, recorded in post-war interviews, said simply, "We were pushed until we could not move. That was the plan." Such lines are short, but they carry weight because they match the fragmentary administrative records. Lists of transfers, the tally of rations, camp logs noting those who did not return from work. In the middle work itself, the rails still cut the floor where carts once carried fuselages and engine parts. Bolted to the rock are the outlines of long benches where men did the precision work that rockets required. The juxtaposition is stark, tools of modern engineering set beside the evidence of human deprivation. Technically, assembling a V-2 underground presented multiple challenges. The rockets were tall, delicate in assembly, and required vertical clearances for stacking stages and for test runs. Tolerances for components like the turbopump were narrow. The solution was to break assembly into discrete stations. Components manufactured or finished in smaller shops were brought together at final benches. Test firing was handled at specialized stands, often muffled or vented discreetly. Wartime shortages meant that materials varied in quality. Impurities in metal and interrupted supply chains caused structural and performance problems. Yet, despite these constraints, the middlework produced a significant number of A4s. Production figures are contested in parts, but archival documentation shows that output increased in late 1944 into 1945 as the program intensified, even as the front collapsed. The human face of that output is most visible in the medical and camp records. The camp at Dora expanded into a network. Work contingents attached to the underground works were supported by satellite camps across the region. Ebensee in Austria, for instance, became another node in this system.
There, tunnels driven into the hillside had been started to hide production and to exploit forced labor. The Ebensee camp was part of the Mauthausen complex. Prisoners were moved there for construction and production tasks.
Again, the data are partial. Reported death tolls vary among sources, but the pattern is consistent: brutal labor, inadequate food, disease, beatings, and a large number of fatalities during the months leading up to liberation. Survivor narratives from Ebensee speak of forced marches, rapidly improvised hospitals that could not treat the number of ill, and mass graves dug in hurried secrecy. These recollections have been corroborated by after-war excavations and witness statements. The macroscopic story is clear even when precise totals remain a matter of scholarly work. Not all underground ambitions were strictly industrial. On the coast of northern France, plans to build superguns and missile launch facilities took a different form. The Mimoyek site, part of a broader coastal development that included Watton and the Lacopole complex, was conceived to host the V3, a multi-chambered supergun designed to send projectiles across the Channel to London. The engineering was audacious: long shafts and galleries set to house a series of propellant chambers intended to successively accelerate a shell. If completed, the V3 had the potential to rain destruction from a fixed concealed emplacement. Allied intelligence, however, detected signs of the project early enough that concerted bombing and specialized attacks degraded the site before it could be brought into full service. Reconnaissance photos, combined with intercepted reports and local intelligence, gave the Allies the evidence they needed to prioritize strikes. The result was heavy bombardment, followed by post-war investigations that found partially completed tunnels, collapsed galleries, and a survivable but ruined infrastructure. Chemical weapons were another dark current under the surface. Falkenhagen, an inland site, appears in wartime paperwork as a location where preparations for production of nerve agents, sarin among them, were planned. Archival audits after the war and Allied interrogations exposed blueprints and procurement orders indicating that the technology and some infrastructure had been put in place, though the large-scale deployment of such agents was not carried out. The near availability of industrial-scale sarin production horrified post-war auditors. Records show that tanks, piping, and containment measures had been considered. Samples and design schematics survived in captured documents. The crucial fact is that chemical deployment did not occur at scale, but the existence of the plans and partial installations demonstrates how close certain programs came to a threshold that might have produced mass civilian casualties. This is not theoretical dramatization, but archival evidence of intention and partial capability. Allied response to the subterranean program evolved as intelligence matured.
Photo interpreters learn to recognize subtle signs: unnatural heat plumes, alignment of service roads, the telltale concentric rings of soil collapse at portals, and, crucially, the presence of venting structures that hinted at underground combustion or ventilation. Once sites were identified, the Allies had options: interdiction of supply lines, targeted bombing to break access points, or the use of specially designed ordnance meant to penetrate reinforced concrete. Squadron 617, famed earlier for the Dam Busters raid, found itself again in a role that required unusual bonds and precise delivery. Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs, developed by Barnes-Wallis and employed later in the war, were intended to fracture and collapse hardened structures. When accurately delivered, they could make subterranean works unusable. Yet bombing was not a benign action. Collapsing a roof could bury forced laborers under rubble. Allied planners faced a moral and tactical calculus: strike and risk killing those you aimed to liberate, or delay to try to minimize casualties at the cost of allowing production and further deaths elsewhere to continue. This calculus appears repeatedly in wartime correspondence. Some planners argued for aggressive targeting, others favored indirect approaches that aimed to strangle logistics rather than break concrete.
The ambiguity of those choices illustrates the moral fog of strategic warfare. Where possible, intelligence services tried to time strikes to minimize prisoner presence, used partisan reports to identify shifts in guard patterns, and prioritized sites where production would most threaten Allied populations. In some cases, targeted attacks at plants like Mimoyex and Wotten appears to have significantly reduced the operational prospects of the projects they attacked. In others, dispersal of production, the very strategy of going underground, complicated the Allies' work and prolonged the period during which coercive labor continued. Resistance and sabotage from within the coerced workforce was another variable. There are documented instances of prisoners intentionally slowing production, damaging components, or misassembling parts to delay operations. These acts carried enormous personal risk. Discovery often meant immediate execution. Yet sabotage was present in the record, and it contributed to the imperfect nature of underground production. These small acts of defiance, recorded in testimony and in post-war trials, deserve recognition as part of the human struggle against a system designed to erase individuality and resistance. When the war ended, the subterranean sites entered a new chapter of secrecy and appropriation. Allied teams moved quickly to secure technology and to document what they found. Some equipment and blueprints were removed intact for analysis, other materials were left to rust. Soviet and Western forces both engaged in salvage operations where occupation zones allowed, hauling away machine tools, engines, and whole assemblies that could be repurposed or studied. In the case of rocket programs, both sides sought expertise as well as hardware. The extraction of personnel and knowledge, often by coercive means, became part of the post-war competition. Werner von Braun, for example, and many of his colleagues were interrogated and eventually absorbed into post-war rocketry efforts under Operation Paperclip in the United States, a fact that complicates any simple moral accounting. Technical knowledge was transferred into new national projects even as its original context of forced labor and criminality remained a shadow. Not every site was stripped. Many were sealed or collapsed intentionally to prevent reuse or to hide evidence. Military engineers filled entrances with concrete, detonated access galleries, and erected fences. Others were left open but declared dangerous. Over the decades, nature and entropy did the rest. Timber supports rot, shotcrete flakes, and galleries slowly choke with silt and water. Some sites became hazards. Exposed reinforced steel corrodes into jagged edges, unmarked shafts present fall risks, and munitions left unaccounted for still occasionally turn up. Environmental contamination remains a concern at a few locations where residues of fuels, lubricants, or even chemical precursors were present. Because of these dangers, modern authorities restrict access, control archaeology and restoration efforts, and, in several cases, document the remains under state supervision rather than opening them to general visitors. This post-war handling raises ethical questions about memory and access. Some argue for full preservation and public access as a way to confront the past transparently. Others point to safety and dignity concerns, arguing that certain spaces must remain closed or conserved in a way that prevents tourists from transforming sites of atrocity into spectacles. Mittelbau Dora offers a model of partial openness. The camp complex around the Mittelwerk has been turned into a memorial and museum where visitors can learn about the network of exploitation that fed the underground factories. The museum frames technical description within the moral context of forced labor, and its exhibits emphasize survivors' testimony alongside machinery. In contrast, other tunnels remain closed to the public for safety and legal reasons, their secrets sealed behind official locks and bureaucratic decisions.
Legal and ethical considerations also govern archaeological work. Where excavations proceed, they do so under strict conditions, often with survivors groups and historians involved to ensure that research is respectful and that any human remains are treated with dignity.
There are also practical constraints. Archives are incomplete, records are scattered across countries and languages, and some documentation was deliberately destroyed as the Reich collapsed. Historians must therefore piece together narratives from fragmentary evidence, production logs, transportation lists, aerial photographs, survivors' interviews, and the occasional engineering drawing. The resulting picture is complex and often contested in detail, though the broad outlines, the program to move production underground, the use of forced labor, and the significant loss of life are well established. The physical traces that remain are small but eloquent. A rusted coupling on a rail, a corroded press bearing the name of a manufacturer that today produces household goods, a brittle list of names and numbers shoved into a hollow. Each item provides a tactile link to the past. Some of these objects have been conserved and placed in museum displays. Others lie in situ, their preservation dependent on time and environment. The choice to preserve an object or to leave it in place is itself a moral decision. To display is to educate, but to display poorly risks trivialization. Historians also debate counterfactuals. Would a fully functional, large-scale underground armaments complex have changed the course of the war? Some argue that even if production had moved largely underground, the logistical collapse, fuel shortages, transportation disruptions, and manpower attrition would have constrained German capacity more than underground factories could compensate. Others suggest a hypothetical in which more effective concealment and increased production might have prolonged certain campaigns or made specific Allied operations costlier. This is the realm of scholarly conjecture, and it must be treated as such, debated possibilities rather than settled conclusions. The essential point is that while technology can shift tactical balances, it cannot erase the political, social, and moral constraints that shape the outcomes of war. Returning to the present, the sites we have described are a mix of accessible memorials, sealed galleries, and landscapes that wear everyday life above them. Villages sit where concourses of forced labor once marched. Quiet roads follow routes that transported materials to hidden mouths in the hillside. The conservation of memory requires constant effort. Memorials need funding, archives must be maintained, and survivor testimony must be recorded before it is lost to time. In some places, local communities have embraced preservation. In others, the desire to move on or the complications of legal ownership have slowed the process. Heinz Rabi, the geologist who unlocked the hatch at our opening, speaks now of his own small set of choices after the war. He worked in reconstruction projects and later in preserving certain sites because, he says, the rock remembers even when we do not.
His periodic inspections are part public safety, part stewardship. He knows the law that orders sites closed and the moral calculus that argues for openness. He also knows the practicalities. Some tunnels are unstable. Some contain materials that require specialized remediation. He has seen looters and relic hunters try to pry loose artifacts, and he has fought to keep sensitive areas under professional supervision. For him, the hill is neither wholly past nor wholly present. It is a living object that demands ethical attention. The last, most intimate evidence of what these places mean is the memory of those who survived. Max Handmeimer's short, steady lines from the earlier interviews thread through the museum exhibits and archival testimony. Others, unnamed in these records, left notes, carved marks, or scratched dates into stone. One freed inmate later wrote a single sentence that was reproduced in an oral history archive. "We were counted in sums. The names came back slowly." Those names have been the focus of post-war memorial efforts, lists compiled by survivors, names recorded on plaques, and ceremonies that attempt, imperfectly, to restore individuality to those reduced to labor statistics. The last, most intimate evidence of what these places mean is the memory of those who survived. The sealed slab on the Bavarian slope is not a conclusion, but a physical reminder of choices made and responsibilities not yet fully taken up. The padlock, the official sign, and the bureaucratic ledger that keeps entries to a strict minimum are modern ways to manage an old secret. Standing above it, with the light catching the rust on the ring of keys, a person can imagine both the engineering calculations that drove planners underground and the human calculations, those of hunger, fear, and endurance that made the engineering possible. The moral demand is simple: to remember fully and honestly, to preserve testimony, and to maintain physical sites in ways that respect victims and educate future generations. We close with one small, precise image. The geologist replaces the padlock and secures the hatch. He pauses at the lip of the slab, runs a gloved hand along the cold metal, and looks back once more into the slope as if the hill might speak. He steps away, and a thin wind carries, briefly, a sound like water in a pipe, a natural echo or an artifact of ventilation. Their work preserves testimony and safeguards the material traces we have described. No one was supposed to find this place underground. We found it because the traces remained, in concrete, in rust, in the pages of transport lists, and in the voices of those who survived. Finding is not an end, it is an obligation, to remember, to bear witness, and to make sure that the hidden costs of secrecy are not forgotten.